Linear games have something special. They know exactly where they want to take you. No massive maps, endless side quests, or hours of wondering what to do next. Just great stories, memorable characters, and one focused journey. So if you love games that get straight to the point, here are 20 linear games you absolutely need to play. If you want a game that feels like playing through a blockbuster adventure movie, Uncharted 4 is almost impossible to beat. It's packed with huge set pieces, gorgeous locations, ridiculous escapes, and that classic Nathan Drake energy where every simple climbing section somehow ends with an entire building collapsing. But what really makes it work is the pacing. The story constantly moves forward without drowning you in pointless side activities. You're exploring, shooting, solving puzzles, and watching the characters actually develop. And because the whole adventure is so tightly directed, every chapter feels like it has a purpose. This is linear gaming done with serious style. If you've ever wanted a proper James Bond game with a modern cinematic presentation, 007 First Light is definitely worth playing. Rather than giving you a giant open world to wander around, the game focuses on a tightly structured Bond adventure, which honestly feels like the right choice. You get stealth, shooting, gadgets, driving, and the kind of stylish situations where Bond somehow walks away from things that should absolutely have killed him. What makes it interesting is that it explores a younger version of Bond before he becomes the legendary agent we know. So instead of playing an already perfect 007, you get to see the guy earn that.
Need to hit your ride.
What Remains of Edith Finch is proof that a linear game doesn't need explosions, giant bosses, or a 100-hour campaign to leave an impression. This is a short, strange, beautifully written experience about Edith Finch exploring her family's unusual history. Each story is presented differently, and that's where the game gets really creative. One minute, you're doing something completely ordinary, and the next, you're experiencing someone's life through a bizarre little interactive sequence you probably weren't expecting. It never overstays its welcome either. You can finish it in a few hours, but some of its stories will stick in your head much longer. It's basically a playable collection of beautifully weird short stories.
My mom was always trying to move on, but for Edie, the past never went away. She could see it poking out of the water at low tide.
The Last of Us Part 1 is one of those games where the linear structure actually makes the story stronger. There's no giant map distracting you from what matters. You move from one situation to the next, and every location exists to push the characters or story forward. And that gives the relationship between Joel and Ellie room to develop naturally. Of course, there's plenty of brutal combat, tense encounters, and infected trying their best to ruin your afternoon. But the quieter moments are arguably even more important. The game knows when to slow down. By the end, you're not just finishing another story. You've spent enough time with these characters to actually care about what happens to them. God of War took a series known for pure chaos and somehow turned it into one of the most personal action adventures of its generation. And despite having some areas you can explore off the main path, the core story is beautifully focused. The journey of Kratos and Atreus gives the entire game a clear sense of direction, while the relationship between them slowly changes in ways that feel surprisingly believable. Then you have the combat, which is basically Kratos solving every disagreement with an axe. The pacing is fantastic too, constantly switching between massive battles, exploration, puzzles, and quieter conversations. It feels cinematic without taking control away from you, which is exactly what a great linear adventure should do. Soma is the kind of game that starts as a creepy horror experience and then slowly makes you question things you probably didn't want to think about at 2 a.m. Set in an underwater research facility, it keeps throwing unsettling discoveries at you while gradually revealing what's actually going on. There's very little wasted space here. Every room, conversation, and discovery feels like it exists for a reason, and the story keeps pulling you deeper into its mystery. The horror is great, but honestly, the psychological side is what stays with you. Soma isn't just interested in scaring you, it wants to leave you staring at the credits thinking, okay, what exactly is a person? Pragmata is one of those games that immediately grabs your attention. Set in a futuristic world on the moon, the game follows Hugh, an astronaut who becomes involved with a mysterious android girl named Diana. It's a mix of action, hacking, and a strange sci-fi atmosphere that feels completely different from Capcom's usual lineup. And that's exactly why it belongs on a list like this. Rather than another massive open world, Pragmata looks designed around a focused adventure with a clear narrative. Honestly, it is one seriously memorable trip to the moon. A Plague Tale: Innocence doesn't waste much time introducing you to its nightmare. Medieval France is already having a terrible day, and then things get considerably worse when Amicia and her younger brother Hugo are forced to survive war, the Inquisition, and an absolutely horrifying plague of rats. The linear structure works perfectly because the story is constantly pushing these two forward. You sneak, solve environmental puzzles, distract enemies, and occasionally discover something that makes you think, yeah, I definitely don't want to be here. But underneath all the darkness is the relationship between Amicia and Hugo. Their journey is what gives the game its emotional weight, and by the end, you genuinely feel like you've been through something with them.
No, nothing there.
Hey, men! This way!
Hi-Fi Rush is basically what happens when someone decides that an action game should have the energy of a Saturday morning cartoon and a music video at the same time. Everything moves to the beat, from combat and environmental animations to attacks and even some of the background details. You play as Chai, a wannabe rock star whose accidental upgrade turns him into a walking corporate problem. The story is straightforward, the levels are tightly designed, and the whole adventure keeps introducing new mechanics without becoming unnecessarily complicated. And then there's the humor, which is actually funny instead of constantly screaming, "Look, joke!" at you. It's colorful, energetic, and ridiculously charming from beginning to end.
Teach him a lesson. Balancing creativity with realistic goals is the mark of a good leader. Clearly, Zamzo needs guidance.
He never understood Roxanne's vision for Vandelay.
Resident Evil 4 Remake is a fantastic example of how to make a linear game feel incredibly varied. Leon Kennedy's mission starts as a simple rescue operation and quickly turns into one of the worst work trips imaginable. You move through villages, castles, underground facilities, and plenty of places where Leon probably should have just turned around and called someone else. The game constantly throws new enemies, weapons, puzzles, and set pieces at you, so the straightforward structure never feels repetitive. And the combat is so satisfying that even clearing out another room full of enemies feels rewarding. It's focused, polished, tense, and somehow manages to make a 6-hour walk through a nightmare feel like an absolute blast. Portal 2 is one of those games that somehow manages to be hilarious, clever, and genuinely challenging without ever feeling like it's trying too hard. Most of the game is built around solving increasingly ridiculous test chambers using the portal gun, but the puzzles are only half the reason it's so memorable. The writing is fantastic, especially the wonderfully unhinged conversations from characters like Wheatley and GLaDOS. The campaign also keeps introducing new mechanics at exactly the right moments, so you're constantly learning something new. And because everything is so carefully designed around the puzzles and story, there's practically no wasted space. It's linear, focused, and still one of the smartest games ever made.
That master turret there has a template. Now, if we pull out the template turret, it'll shut down the whole production line. Right, I'm gonna have to hack the door so that we can get at it.
Alan Wake 2 takes the idea of a linear narrative and turns it into something much stranger. You follow Alan Wake and FBI agent Saga Anderson through two connected stories, switching between their perspectives as the mystery slowly comes together. The game constantly plays with reality, storytelling, and the idea of fiction affecting the real world, so you're never quite sure what you're supposed to believe. And Remedy absolutely goes wild with the presentation. There are live action sequences, bizarre musical moments, unsettling locations, and some genuinely creepy horror. It can get weird. Very weird, but that's part of the appeal. This isn't a game you simply play through. It's a story that keeps messing with your head.
It's here. I knew it would be.
Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is a much more intimate experience than most action games. Instead of giving you a massive world to explore, it keeps you closely connected to Senua as she travels through a dark and deeply personal journey inspired by Norse and Celtic mythology. The game uses environmental puzzles, combat, sound, and unsettling visual effects to put you directly into her experience. And the binaural audio deserves special mention because wearing headphones can make some scenes genuinely uncomfortable in a very intentional way. It's not particularly long, and that's a strength. The developers clearly knew what story they wanted to tell and didn't stretch it into a 40-hour adventure just because they could. Astro Bot is proof that a linear platformer can still feel incredibly fresh in an era where everything seems to need a giant map. The game takes you through a series of colorful levels packed with creative platforming challenges, clever surprises, and an almost ridiculous number of PlayStation references. And the best part is how often it manages to surprise you. Just when you think you've figured out the gimmick of a level, the game introduces another idea and runs with it. The controls feel fantastic, the presentation is ridiculously charming, and the whole thing has this constant, just one more level energy. It's simple, focused, and probably one of the happiest games you'll play. Silent Hill 2 Remake is not exactly the kind of game you play when you want to relax. You follow James Sunderland into the fog-covered town of Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his supposedly dead wife, and things get worse from there. Much of the experience revolves around exploration, puzzles, disturbing encounters, and slowly uncovering what really happened. The remake keeps the psychological horror at the center, rather than relying entirely on cheap scares. The town itself feels like a character, with every dark hallway and foggy street making you wonder what's waiting around the next corner. And the story becomes increasingly uncomfortable the more you understand it. It's a slow burn, but that's exactly why it works. Final Fantasy VII Remake takes one of the most famous RPGs ever made and turns it into a much more focused cinematic experience. You follow Cloud and the gang through Midgar, moving between story-heavy sections, combat, exploration, and the occasional side activity. The scale of Midgar is impressive, but what really carries the game is its characters. Cloud's permanently confused expression alone deserves an award. The real-time combat is also a huge departure from the original, mixing traditional RPG mechanics with fast action. And while this is only one part of the larger story, the remake gives Midgar enough personality that it feels like an entire adventure on its own.
Sorry. Here it comes.
Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is basically a playable Pixar movie where everyone has access to extremely dangerous weapons. The story moves quickly, the levels are beautifully designed, and the game constantly throws some new idea at you before you've had enough time to get comfortable. The biggest gimmick is obviously the Rift technology, letting you jump between different dimensions almost instantly. But underneath all the visual spectacle is incredibly satisfying platforming and shooting. Every weapon feels ridiculous in exactly the right way, and the humor keeps the adventure light without getting annoying. It's a fantastic choice if you want something linear, polished, colorful, and impossible to take too seriously.
Keep firing, Ratchet! You heard him, everyone!
Titanfall 2 has one of the best single-player campaigns in the FPS genre, and the fact that it's relatively short is actually part of the reason it works so well. Instead of dragging one idea across 20 hours, it constantly changes things up. One mission might have you running across walls at full speed, while another throws you into a giant titan. Then there's Effect and Cause, which basically shows what happens when a developer decides normal level design isn't enough anymore. The relationship between Jack Cooper and BT also gives the campaign a surprising amount of heart. It's fast, creative, funny, and over before you start wondering when it's going to get good, because it already was. Black Myth Wukong takes the legendary Chinese story of the Monkey King and turns it into a visually spectacular action RPG. While there are areas to explore and plenty of optional discoveries, the main adventure remains strongly focused on moving from one major encounter to the next, and those encounters are where the game really shines. The combat gives you different spells, transformations, staff techniques, and abilities to experiment with, while the bosses are constantly trying to ruin your day. The presentation is also stunning, with environments and creatures that look like they escaped from a Chinese mythology painting. It's challenging, stylish, and much more focused than the typical giant open world RPG. It Takes Two is probably the only game on this list where you can't do it alone is literally part of the design. Built entirely around two-player cooperation, it follows Cody and May after they're magically transformed into tiny dolls. From there, the game keeps throwing completely different mechanics at you. One moment you're platforming, the next you're flying, shooting, racing, or doing something so bizarre that you'll probably ask, why is this actually fun? The story is surprisingly heartfelt too, even when the characters are being incredibly frustrating. And because the gameplay constantly changes, the linear structure never feels restrictive. It's one of those games that's best experienced with another person, and preferably someone who won't blame you for every missed jump.
Oops. I told her I did that when I was a kid.
So you're the guilty one.
Jack, she's outgrown them anyway.
Little Nightmares 2 is a short, creepy adventure that proves atmosphere can do more work than a giant open world ever could. You play as Mono, a mysterious boy traveling through a distorted world filled with unsettling creatures and places that look like they came directly from someone's worst nightmare. The gameplay is straightforward: platforming, puzzles, stealth, and occasional combat, but the presentation does most of the heavy lifting. Every room feels wrong in a way that's difficult to explain, and the game constantly makes you wonder what you're actually looking at. It's also smart about keeping things moving, so the mystery never gets buried under unnecessary filler. And that ending? Yeah, you're probably going to need a minute. Stellar Blade is a great pick if you want something that feels like a big budget action game without disappearing into a 100-hour open world. The main story keeps moving through distinct locations, mixing fast combat, exploration, platforming, and some surprisingly strange side characters along the way. The combat is easily the star of the show, especially once you start getting comfortable with parries, dodges, and different abilities. And visually, the game is ridiculously polished. There's also a decent amount of optional content, but the main adventure gives you a clear sense of direction. Basically, if you like your linear action games with flashy combat and absolutely no shortage of stylish characters, this one delivers.
Star Wars Jedi Survivor takes the formula from Fallen Order and expands it without completely losing the focused adventure feeling. Cal Kestis is still traveling across the galaxy, fighting Imperial forces, exploring ancient locations, and getting himself into situations where lightsabers are probably the least of his problems. The worlds are larger this time, but the main story remains easy to follow, and the major moments are packed with cinematic set pieces and great lightsaber combat. You also get more fighting styles, more abilities, and plenty of platforming between battles. It feels like playing through your own Star Wars adventure, except your version of Cal probably spends way too much time falling off cliffs. Sifu takes a simple revenge story and turns it into one of the most satisfying beat-em-up experiences around. You're hunting down the people responsible for your family's destruction, but there's one small problem. Dying doesn't exactly mean the end. Instead, you age, and getting older changes the way your journey plays out. The combat is where Sifu really earns its place here. Every fight feels like a test of timing, positioning, and patience, rather than simply smashing buttons until everyone stops moving. The levels are tightly designed, the story stays focused, and the whole experience encourages you to replay areas and get better. It will humble you repeatedly, but when you finally master a section, it feels fantastic. Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons is one of those games that looks simple on the surface, but knows exactly how to use gameplay to tell its story. You control two brothers simultaneously as they travel across a fantasy world searching for a cure for their sick father. There isn't a huge amount of combat or complicated progression. Instead, the game focuses on exploration, environmental puzzles, and the relationship between the brothers. The clever control scheme makes that relationship part of the gameplay itself, rather than just something you watch in cutscenes. It's also a relatively short experience, which works perfectly. The game tells exactly the story it wants to tell, then gets out before it starts repeating itself. Rise of the Tomb Raider strikes a really nice balance between cinematic storytelling, exploration, and action. Lara Croft's journey takes her through snowy mountains, ancient ruins, underground tombs, and plenty of places where apparently Nobody bothered putting up a dangerous archaeological site sign. The main campaign is fairly focused, but there are optional tombs and activities if you want to explore beyond the story. And those tombs are some of the best parts, giving you proper environmental puzzles instead of just another shooting gallery. Combat is equally satisfying, especially when you start using the environment and Lara's tools creatively. It feels like a modern adventure movie, except you're the one making Lara do all the dangerous stuff.
He's gone! He's reloading! Shoot him!
Clair Obscur. Expedition 33 is a fascinating example of how a linear RPG can still feel massive. The story follows the members of Expedition 33 as they set out to stop the mysterious Paintress, whose actions have been wiping out people of a certain age year after year. The game has plenty of exploration and optional discoveries, but its narrative remains tightly focused around the expedition and its characters. And the turn-based combat adds real-time elements like dodging, parrying, and countering, so you're not just sitting there waiting for menus to finish doing the work. Add the gorgeous Belle Epoque-inspired world, memorable characters, and surprisingly emotional storytelling, and you've got an RPG that feels ambitious without getting lost in its own size.
A storm is coming.
And that's the beauty of linear games. They don't need to be massive to be memorable. They just need a great story and a reason to keep you moving forward. If you enjoyed the list, let me know which linear game you think deserves a spot here. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.